Koumajou Remilia Scarlet Symphony is a remaster of a 13-year-old game. I'm not exactly a fan of this type of practice, but since I was completely unfamiliar with the game, this one was completely new to me, and with an aesthetic that led me to believe it was a Castlevania clone, suggested me that there was little to no chance of the game being bad. Well, it's neither good nor bad, quite the opposite. Since you are here, why don't you like, comment, or even better, subscribe the channel for more reviews or even short news. Thank you very much. Koumajou Remilia Scarlet Symphony is an action platformer game that both on IGDB and Steam shows as an RPG, although what it may have of an RPG component is limited to a set of dialogues before and after the boss battles in which we have any interference. There is no great waste of time explaining the story. There is a scarlet haze that has spread across the world that emanates from the newly built castle of the vampire Remilia. Reimu, our character, has to investigate what's going on. I'm not used to play games that are more traditionally associated with Japanese culture, so when I started listening to the music it seemed fantastic, with an adaptation both to the more gothic tone of the game and to the speed in which it practically demands to be played. The voice acting itself is many notches above what I'm used to, but more because of the hole where the game constantly gets into with dialogues, which multiple times tries to make the actors to be forced to represent complicated and unnatural situations, which usually turn out badly in video games, always sounding unnatural. Silences, interjections, or sudden changes in the tone of voice to simulate emotions that we usually only see in kid cartoons. In Koumajou Remilia Scarlet Symphony, all this works, and it works quite well. Adding to that, everything is written and represented with humor, that humor that we use with friends in the way we normally mock each other on a day-to-day basis. Graphically, there is pixel art in 2D with two background planes, interspersed with dialogue screens in the style of any dating simulator in a more usual cartoonish style. There is nothing transcendent in this field. I would even venture to say that the graphic choice creates points where it is difficult to distinguish the foreground from the background, which means that at times I ended up eating objects that I thought were just part of the scenery, something that also happened a lot in Narita Boy, for instance. Koumajou Remilia Scarlet Symphony is a completely linear game, and I usually enjoy that, as it allows me to play in an uncompromising and carefree way. Not forcing us to look for surprises make it much more difficult for a game to surprise us, as it is totally dependent on its story or gameplay to stand out. With an attack to use in melee combat, we use what looks like a whip to me, but which is officially a purification wand, which we can alternate with a ranged attack that consumes resources each time it is used. We can also fly, something that throughout the game looks like a cheat code, something that is even parodied in the game if we abuse the mechanics or use it in some way that we shouldn't. It seems that we are cheating the system when we use it because it doesn't consume any resources, and it completely subverts the use of platforms, and it only seems essential when fighting the bosses, since in that moment the game assumes itself like a bullet hell, and flying is essential for a good player to be able to dodge the multiple attacks. There's also a problem I often point out to these games, the annoying way in which they insist on having enemies attacking us from off-screen. Koumajou Remilia Scarlet Symphony abuses it as much as Mel Gibson abuses alcohol. In addition, we only attack horizontally, perhaps as a way of compensating for the fact that we can fly, and this causes many frustrating moments where enemies are a mere millimeter above or below us, something much more noticeable when the scenario has slopes. This compensation mechanism created this problem, which is then compensated by another mechanism. The hitboxes are too generous, giving the feeling that just seeing an enemy is enough for the whip to reach him immediately, at least in the horizontal plane. During the game, some characters join our party, and we can summon them to make some attacks at the expense of resources. The first two, which came from the original game, are balanced and adapt to the game itself, while the character that was added in this remaster seems somewhat out of place, because its attack is used in a very different way from the other two, making this character much more useful in higher difficulties crowd control, while the two previously were more useful in boss fights. Since we are speaking of difficulty, this remaster introduces the extra easy difficulty, which led me to mistakenly believe that the game would be extra hard. Although we can make it a challenge, the game is quite balanced in terms of difficulty, and we can even choose the number of lives with which we want to start playing with. All this becomes irrelevant after realizing that this game does not have a save system. It just allows us to choose the level where we want to start as we unlock new levels as we beat them in the game. When we start from the home screen, we get all our lives back, and we just lose the resources we got in the previous runs. After finishing the main game, we are presented with another level that adds to the story, although for the story itself it is little or nothing relevant at all. This level is more difficult than the normal game, and it condenses many of the mechanics that we had already faced and introduces new enemies. In terms of replay value, it doesn't offer much more than replaying everything with a higher difficulty or with the aim of scoring more points. A final note for the impossibility of remapping the controls. It's not relevant, nor are they poorly mapped to begin with, but I wanted to swap one of the keys and I never got around to do it. Koumajou Remilia Scarlet Symphony is an interesting game, especially in its artistic components. It's one of the many games that is fun to play once and we end up forgetting about it afterwards, but for around 2 hours of content in the story mode, €30 seems like a very high price to pay, especially considering games like Cuphead, Celeste, Castlevania Advanced Collection or Ori and the Blind Forest Definitive Edition, that are all way cheaper and way better. It's hard to justify a spot for Koumajou Remilia Scarlet Symphony, especially since it doesn't have anything that makes it stand out, that makes me say I have to play it for some reason. For that reason alone, it seems to me that it will be another game that will not gain a lot of traction. Look at my case, I just played it because I took it for something different. That says a lot. See you next time, guys. Bye!